In a prior video, we looked at the best storylines in WWE for every year of this century. But what about the flip side to that? What about the worst angles WWE has given us? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the worst story of 2000, Mae Young's pregnancy. Now, if you were a fan of WWF during the Attitude Era, then you'll no doubt remember this one as it's since gone down in infamy. That's right, the idea here was that Mae Young, despite being a senior citizen already by then, had started an on-screen romance with Mark Henry, and this had eventually led to her falling pregnant with the world's strongest man's child. Of course, Mae wasn't really pregnant here though, and that meant the creative team had to figure out a way to get out of this one quickly. What would they eventually decide upon? Well, in the end, the former women's champion would give birth to a hand. Yes, it didn't make much sense then, and it still doesn't make much sense now. But at least the whole angle didn't hobble any careers like our next entry did, the time in 2001 when Diamond Dallas Page was revealed to be the stalker of The Undertaker's wife. Come on now, this one should have been so easy. After all, during the latter years of WCW, DDP was able to make himself into a huge star for that promotion. So when the invasion angle saw World Championship Wrestling invade WWF, the idea should have been to present Page as a serious threat. But that's not what happened here, because after weeks of vignettes showed a mysterious stalker terrorizing The Undertaker's wife Sarah, we got the reveal that the New Jersey native had been the one behind the whole thing. Obviously then, this immediately nerfed his run in WWE, as it was a complete betrayal of the character DDP had in his prior home. And it didn't even make sense in kayfabe, as we already knew Page had a wife in Kimberly. All it did was speed up the demise of the invasion. And that would mean this storyline would no longer be around in 2002. No, that year, the worst WWE had to offer was Katie Vick. Okay, this one really shouldn't require much explanation, as at this point it's gone down as being amongst the worst wrestling storylines to ever take place anywhere. And the reason for that is because it's centered around the idea that a car crash Kane had been involved in when he was a young man led to his girlfriend passing away. But that wasn't the worst of it. No, after this happened, the Big Red Machine was then alleged to have spent some special time with Katie post-mortem, something which, even by the standards of 2002, was pretty tasteless. Yes, you won't see this one brought up in retrospectives anytime soon, and you won't see that footage of Triple H wearing a Kane mask in the funeral parlor on any future episodes of Raw. No, WWE probably wishes they could erase the whole thing from history entirely, but they can't. Just as they can't erase the worst angle of 2003, the love story between Tori Wilson, Dawn Marie, and Al Wilson. What happened here? Well, back in 2003, as WWE were still attempting to recreate the car crash style of TV which had made them so successful during the Attitude Era, they came up with the idea to have a love triangle of sorts. But this would be no ordinary love triangle, as it would see one woman, namely Dawn Marie, make advances at both a father and a daughter in Al and Tori Wilson. Yes, this was the year where Al Wilson collapsed on his wedding day and ended up expiring in kayfabe. Needless to say then, it was a pretty bad combination of poor taste and general silliness that really proved the Attitude Era was over. But that wouldn't be the end of the bad romance angles in WWE, because 2004 would see an arguably even worse one in the doomed love story of Kane and Lita. Now, there's no way to make this one look good, as the whole idea was that Kane was able to force Lita to marry him after he beat her boyfriend Matt Hardy in a match. As you would expect then, this is not something which would fly today. Hell, even back then it wasn't something the fan base had much time for. And things only got worse when it was revealed that Lita was pregnant. But things would get worse still after Lita lost her kayfabe baby when she was pushed off the ring apron during a match by Gene Snitsky, with this all leading to the infamous baby punting segment from the heel. Truly then, this is an angle which should be relegated to the forgotten part of history, just as our next entry should be too, the rise and fall of Muhammad Hassan. Okay, this didn't have to be a bad storyline. No, there could have been some good to be found in the idea of an Arab American looking to present a more positive portrayal of his people in a post-9/11 world. But then things went off the rail when Hassan turned into just another foreign heel menace, with things reaching their apex when he had a group of masked men attack The Undertaker on an episode of SmackDown that summer. So controversial was this, it would lead to UPN, the TV network the Blue brand was on at the time, demanding Muhammad be taken off TV permanently. And this would force WWE to write him off with immediate effect. Obviously then, this meant he wouldn't be around for 2006 when the worst storyline in WWE was the saga of the imposter Kane. Okay, while Muhammad Hassan could have worked under the right circumstances, this one was pretty much always destined to fail, as imposter characters have never really been something which have worked historically. And it certainly didn't help Kane break that curse that the whole angle never even got out of the starting blocks. No, after one match between the real Glenn Jacobs and the fake version of him played by Doc Gallows stunk out the jointed vengeance that year, Vince McMahon decided to pull the trigger on the whole thing. And this meant we never even got to see the reveal of who was under the mask on screen. Hell, all we got was the real Kane throwing the imposter out of the building and then never speaking of it again, leaving us all to forget about it ourselves. Still though, for as bad as this was, it wasn't anything on the worst storyline of 2007, the reveal that Hornswoggle was Vince McMahon's illegitimate son. Of course, it wasn't initially supposed to be Hornswoggle who was in this role. No, it was supposed to be Mr. Kennedy who would be revealed as the long-lost son of Vince McMahon after months of teasing. But as a result of a combination of injuries and backstage heat, he ended up getting moved away from the role that was originally written for him. And this left WWE with a problem because, as the angle had already begun on TV, they needed someone else to serve as a payoff. Enter Hornswoggle, the person who was eventually chosen to be the second choice for the boss's secret son. And if that makes no sense to you, it made no sense to anyone watching at the time either. Really, this was a low point for creative overall, and one which would later be all but retconned out of existence, as today, the idea that Dylan Postal bears any kayfabe relation to the McMahons is never even brought up. But let's move away from bad family angles for now and over to something a little more simple. A bad main event push which gave us the worst WWE storyline of 2008 in Vladimir Kozlov's rise. That's right, while there were some underrated things happening in 2008 WWE, things like the rise of Jeff Hardy and Chris Jericho's suit and tie clad villain, one thing which certainly wasn't good was the trajectory Vladimir Kozlov was on. And that's because, despite him clearly still being very green, he was pushed all the way to the top of the card at rocket speed. And not just pushed by a half measure either. No, in 2008, Kozlov would pin the likes of The Undertaker right in the middle of the ring, with this making it seem like he was going to be a future world champion on SmackDown. But as we all know now, this would not happen because fans simply didn't take to the Ukrainian. Why was that? Well, he just didn't have what it took to play the role. So it was that by the end of the year then, the Vladimir Kozlov experiment would be over, and 2009 would instead feature a new worst WWE angle in the story of Piggy James. Really, all this one did was make everyone involved look bad. It made Laycool look bad for being presented as bullies, and it made Mickie James look bad for just being associated with the entire thing. But then why wouldn't it, as the whole idea here was that the team made up of Layla and Michelle McCool were picking on Mickie for being too fat. Hell, even if you ignored the tastelessness of it, it didn't make any sense as Mickie was clearly not someone who was overweight. Honestly, this is another one which is best left forgotten and which should never be tried again. But let's move away from that for now and over to the worst WWE angle of 2010 instead, one which was less about someone being bullied and more about a mystery figure pulling the strings of Monday Night Raw from behind the scenes. That's right, it's time to talk about the anonymous Raw General Manager. Now again, this could have been something interesting, but the execution was just so poor, everyone rightly remembers the Raw GM angle as being a low point for the Red brand today. After all, it pretty much just ended up giving us week upon week of a laptop interrupting the show. Still, at least if it had been given a good payoff, then it might have been all worthwhile. But in the end, the payoff would be that Hornswoggle, of all people, was revealed to be the secret general manager, with him conducting all of his business from under the ring, presumably in the magical realm of the little people which canonically exists under there. And this wouldn't be the only time Michael Cole was involved in the worst WWE storyline of the year either, as the very next year he'd also get the dishonor of being part of the low point of 2011, the feud which took place between him and Jerry Lawler. Come on now, how could there be any other choice for the worst WWE storyline of 2011? After all, for a year in which the highs saw the summer of Punk take hold, the lows brought things right back down to earth with one of the worst WrestleMania matches of all time. What made this one such a stinker? Well, it involved two commentators, one of whom had been a very successful wrestler, but who was long past the point of being a regular worker by then, and another of whom had never had a single match in his entire life. Needless to say then, when Cole and Lawler met at Mania 27, it brought the show to a screeching halt. And to make matters worse, it all ended with the guy who was having his first match getting the win. Yes, legendary Memphis figure Jerry Lawler would do the job during his only WrestleMania bout. And Michael Cole would forever go down as one of the very few people who remains undefeated at the Showcase of the Immortals, something even The Undertaker can't say about himself anymore. But what about 2012? Surely Michael Cole wouldn't make it a three-peat here, right? Thankfully he wouldn't. No, this year the worst WWE storyline would be the one centered around Kane, John Cena, and Zack Ryder. Embrace the hate. 3 words which came to sum up the worst WWE had to offer in 2012. What was the idea here? Well, it was that Kane wanted John Cena to embrace the fact that many fans had been booing him for years by this point, with the ultimate goal being to get him to turn heel. As you would expect then, this was all a little cheesy. And it all got worse once Zack Ryder got pulled into the whole thing, as it pretty much nuked any momentum he had going by then with the Ryder Revolution. Come on now, this was the point where, while he was supposed to be ignoring the hate and remaining a babyface, Big Match John ended up stealing Ryder's on-screen girlfriend Eve Torres away from him. And then from there, he watched on as Kane ran Long Island Ice Z off the entrance ramp while he was confined to a wheelchair. Really, the whole thing was a total mess of logic and made no one look stronger by the time all was said and done. So for that reason, it has to be considered the worst WWE angle of 2012. That said, it wasn't the worst of 2013. No, for this year, the worst storyline in WWE would be all about the Big Show instead, and his time spent as a puppet to the Authority. That's right, it's been a joke for years now that throughout his career, the Big Show seemed to alternate between playing a babyface and heel on an almost monthly basis. But the absolute lowest point of this probably came in 2013, as that was when, right as the villainous Authority was at its peak of power, Paul White was forced to join up with the faction against his will. Unsurprisingly then, being forced to help screw over people like Daniel Bryan lest he get fired made the big man conflicted, and that led to some pretty bad scenes of him crying in the middle of the ring, as we were supposed to feel sympathy for him. But few fans felt any sympathy at the time, as few were invested in the angle, mostly because it was bringing down the entire show right when all people wanted to see was the American Dragon win the big one. And the Bryan household would still be a factor in the worst WWE storyline by the time 2014 came around, because it would be Brie Bella who would be involved in the lowest point of that year when she had her infamous feud with her twin sister Nikki. Yes, if you were watching WWE during the mid-2010s, then you no doubt remember this one, as it was one of the more memorable angles of the era, albeit one which was memorable for all the wrong reasons. What did it involve? Well, it involved Nikki turning heel on her sister Brie by aligning herself with the Authority, and in the process, forcing her to be her personal help for an entire month. And that wasn't even the worst of it. No, after this 30-day period ended, and after we got that truly awful promo about what Nikki wished had happened to her sister in the womb, the whole thing would be retconned anyway, as Brie then realigned herself with her sibling once more for no apparent reason, making the entire thing meaningless. And things weren't going to get much better when it came to the worst WWE storyline of 2015 either, as that was the year we got the love quadrangle between Rusev, Dolph Ziggler, Lana, and Summer Rae. That's right, as you might have noticed by now, love stories in wrestling often don't turn out well. And this one was no different, as it damaged the momentum of 4 people rather than just 2. How did it all begin? Well, the whole thing started when WWE made the strange decision to split Rusev and Lana on screen, a curious choice as the pair were by then a legitimate item. And they didn't just split the couple here. No, they had them find new lovers on TV, with Rusev gaining a new valet in Summer Rae, and Lana seemingly moving on with Dolph Ziggler. What happened after that? Well, a lot of bad television is what. Yes, by the time this one was abruptly cancelled after Rusev and Lana announced their real-life engagement via TMZ, fans were desperate to just forget it had ever happened. And as it happened, Rusev would also be a part of the worst WWE storyline of 2016 as well, though this one wouldn't involve his wife. No, this one would center around his membership in the League of Nations alongside Sheamus, Alberto Del Rio, and Wade Barrett. Yes, while it was actually 2015, that was the year when, in an attempt to try and get Roman Reigns over with an audience who were widely rejecting him, WWE decided to pair together a collective of heels who could stand in his way. It was in 2016 that the collective of foreign menaces made up of an Irishman in Sheamus, a Bulgarian in Rusev, a Mexican in Alberto Del Rio, and an Englishman in Wade Barrett reached their absolute nadir, as this was when they were reduced to the level of cannon fodder. Seriously, while the League of Nations were never exactly a legendary faction or anything, at least the year prior they'd held the WWE title within the ranks. But come 2016, things had fallen so far that at WrestleMania 32, their primary role on the show would be to get beaten up by three older legends in Steve Austin, Shawn Michaels, and Mick Foley. Not exactly a promising sign for the future from here on in. And Sheamus's gang of heels weren't the only villains who'd have a tough time during this period, as in 2017, the worst WWE storyline would center around another heel menace in Jinder Mahal. Of course, when we talk about Jinder Mahal here, we're primarily talking about his world title reign. A world title reign which was completely out of nowhere, as only a matter of weeks before he won the gold, the Canadian had been treated like a jobber for years. Needless to say then, fans simply didn't buy into him being the de facto best performer in the company. And this led to a run on top which never threatened to get over in any significant way. Sure, it might have been different if Jinder had actually been built up properly for the role, but then maybe not, as even if this had happened, the reality is that not everyone can be a world champion level wrestler. Honestly, there's a reason that many to this day still consider this to be the weakest WWE title reign of all time, but at least 2018 wouldn't see the gold be part of such a mid-angle. No, that year the worst angle in WWE would be the failed heel turn of Dean Ambrose. That's right, post his run as one-third of the Shield, the booking of Dean Ambrose as a single star on main roster WWE left a lot to be desired. But no matter where things were at any given time with him, there was always the knowledge that the company had that heel turn in their back pocket. So this is why it felt so sad to see the heel turn be executed in 2018 and be botched so spectacularly. Yes, what we got here was a man coming down to the ring in a gas mask telling the audience that they smelled. And it was clear Dean hated this too, as he'd later say it was the final straw in him neglecting to sign a new contract with WWE the following year when his old one ran out. That's right, this one failed so much, it directly led to him leaving the promotion. And he wouldn't be the only Shield member who was involved in a bad storyline towards the end of the 2010s, as the very next year it would be his brother-in-arms, Roman Reigns, who was part of the nadir of WWE during his feud with Baron Corbin. Come on now, if you look back on the history of Roman Reigns in WWE, this has to be considered a low point. After all, after years of trying to get the big dog over with an audience which was widely rejecting him as a top babyface, it felt like the company really were out of ideas when the best they could come up with was having him feud with Baron Corbin over who was the real top dog of SmackDown. And we mean it literally when we talk about this being about who was the top dog, as mocking Roman's big dog moniker, Corbin would at points come out to the ring in a dog costume, all before then handcuffing Reigns to the ring and pouring tins of dog food over him. Honestly, is it any wonder the future tribal chief demanded a character change not long after this? A character change which would finally turn his luck around? But while 2020 may have been a better year for Roman Reigns, it was not a good year for our next subject, the worst WWE storyline of this 12-month period, Retribution. Now 2020 was a year when a lot of things were being thrown at the wall in an attempt to keep viewers interested. After all, with no fans in attendance at shows, it became harder than ever to create an engaging show. But out of all the new things WWE tried during this year, Retribution was certainly not one of the hits. No, in this group made up of T-Bar, Mace, Slapjack, Reckoning, and Retaliation, you had something which was pretty much universally hated. Why was that? Well, rather than being a threatening NWO-style invading heel group, the silly names and even sillier costumes of the fivesome made them come across more like budget Power Rangers villains, and when you compare this to something like the early days of the Bloodline, which was happening the same year, it's easy to see why fans weren't interested. And that tradition of a goofy gimmick being the worst of the year for WWE would also continue on into 2021 as well, as that was the year of the Alexa Bliss and Randy Orton feud. Of course, when you have a career as long as Randy Orton's, there are going to be inevitable peaks and troughs. There's just no way you can be around for 20 plus years and have everything be a hit. But of the low points of the Viper's run, his 2021 feud with Alexa Bliss has to rank way down there amongst the lowest. Why is that? Well, this was when Alexa was playing the role of the Fiend's Herald, and that meant her doing things like making Orton cough up a mysterious black liquid during the middle of a promo segment. And then there was that match at WrestleMania 37 where, while the people actually fighting in the ring were Bray Wyatt and Randy, the focus was largely on Little Miss Bliss sitting on top of a box-like structure at ringside, all while she was inexplicably spewing black goo from her head as well. Realistically, this was the kind of goofy angle which fans just weren't invested in to a real degree at that point. So for that reason, it had to be considered the worst WWE storyline of 2021, just as our next entry, Happy Corbin vs. Madcap Moss, has to be considered the worst WWE storyline of 2022. Now, if you've already forgotten about this one, we wouldn't blame you, as it was not exactly what you'd call a strong story. No, the fact we've listed it as the worst angle WWE did in 2022 should give you a good idea of how people responded to it at the time. What was the actual story playing itself out on screen here? Well, it was that after going through a period as sad Corbin, the Kansas native was able to become happy again after winning all his money back in Las Vegas. And he wasn't the only one who was happy here because, at least initially, Corbin had a sidekick in Madcap Moss, a dad joke-loving goofball. But then, things fell apart between the two and they started feuding with one another. The only problem with that, though, was that this feud just kept going and never led to anything particularly exciting. No, by the time it was over, fans were just happy to forget it had ever taken place at all. Not exactly the kind of payoff you want for a months-long program. And 2023 wouldn't fare any better when it came to lengthy programs failing to get over with WWE fans either, as that year the worst angle the company produced would be the feud between Shayna Baszler and Ronda Rousey. Of course, this was one which could have been good. After all, both Ronda and Shayna were known as being legit MMA fighters prior to their time in WWE, with Rousey in particular being a huge star in the world of UFC. So there was a lot of story potential to be mined out of their past careers. And when you add into this the fact that they were shoot close friends and had been for a long time, it felt like a program between the pairs should have been an easy win. Unfortunately though, by the time it happened, it felt like Ronda was already mentally checked out, and this led to everything just feeling half-baked. Hell, their big match at SummerSlam that year had all the energy of a wake. Sure, it didn't help that the entire angle was rushed through at light speed, but even if it had been given more time to build, it was probably the wrong time for it to take place. And the same could be said about our entry for 2024 as it happened, because that year, the worst angle in WWE would be the program between Jimmy and Jey Uso. Seriously now, there were many points across WWE's history that the Usos coming to blows might have worked. Even as far back as the mid-2010s, this could have been a success with the right build, and on the face of things, 2024 should have been as good a point as any for this to happen. After all, both men had been a part of the lengthy bloodline angle for years before WrestleMania 40, and the history each man had undergone while a part of that stable made it natural for them to finally face off against each other one-on-one at the Showcase of the Immortals. The only problem was, when the match finally did happen, all it ended up being was a bit of a flop, something which was largely seen as the low point of an otherwise all-time great show. Why was that? Well, as it turned out, while the Usos are great as a tag team, they're not so great as opponents. No, this one just didn't click and was not what people had been hoping for coming out of such an emotionally charged history between the two. But at least the Usos wouldn't be involved in the worst WWE storyline of 2025. No, that year it would be all about the inconsistent booking of the Wyatt Six. Now, the Wyatt Six could have been something. Hell, when they were first introduced in 2024, fans were all in on seeing them succeed, as the angle was very clearly a tribute to the late Bray Wyatt. But unfortunately for the fivesome, they've never really been given a chance to get out of the starting blocks on account of how inconsistently they've been booked. That's right, the pattern for Uncle Howdy and company thus far has been showing up for a couple of weeks, then disappearing for months at a time, halting any momentum they'd been able to build. Sure, they're currently SmackDown Tag Team Champions, but even this hasn't been enough to rebuild them fully. No, at the point they're at now, this is something which will take a lot more work. Will this happen? We guess we'll just have to wait and see, but until then, they'll have earned a spot in this video, along with everyone else we've looked at today as one of the worst WWE storylines of the 21st century.